In that dark, storm-swept night, the muddy bank gave way suddenly beneath Shim Hak-yu's feet. He fell helplessly into the rushing stream below, his red ribbon fluttering in the cold, howling downpour. The freezing, rapid current dragged him down into the swirling black water. Unable to see, he struggled wildly against the torrent, barely managing to thrust his face above the surface to gasp for fresh air. His wet, trembling hands scraped against the muddy bank, finally catching a slippery, exposed tree root. Clinging to it with his failing strength, he cried out his beloved daughter's name into the roaring storm. Meanwhile, having finished her long day of hard work, Cheong hurried home through the torrential rain. With every gust of cold wind, a strange, heavy anxiety began to tighten in her young chest. Reaching the cottage, Cheong froze to find the front wooden gate swung wide open in the wind. Her father's familiar walking cane was missing from its usual spot, and a deep sense of dread washed over her. Walking along the roaring creek, a monk from Mungunsa Temple paused. Through the thick, heavy curtain of falling rain, his ears caught a faint, desperate cry for help rising from the turbulent, swollen water. Raising his warm paper lantern, the monk cast a bright glow over the turbulent water. The light caught a floating red ribbon and the struggling, exhausted figure of Shim Hak-yu, who was barely holding on. Sensing the immediate danger, the monk braced his feet firmly on the slippery mud. He unraveled his long, sturdy monastic robe and threw the thick fabric down toward the drowning man in the creek below. Shim Hak-yu grasped the wet fabric with a desperate, iron grip. With a heavy heave, the monk pulled with all his might, slowly dragging the exhausted father onto the shallow, muddy edge of the creek. Collapsing onto the wet grass, Shim Hak-yu shivered violently in the cold. The monk knelt beside him, wrapping his own dry, warm cloak around the father's freezing shoulders to offer immediate comfort and safety. Down the dark road, Cheong searched frantically, holding a small lantern against the rising wind. Though the storm threatened to extinguish her light, she pressed on along the rising creek, calling for him repeatedly. Recovering his breath, Shim Hak-yu realized his kind savior was a Buddhist monk. He knelt on the muddy ground, bowing his head in deep, tearful gratitude for the unexpected gift of his life tonight. He explained how he had ended up in the swollen creek. He had ventured out to search for his young daughter, who was late returning, but his blindness had led him astray in this storm. He then shared the deepest, most sacred yearning of his heart, to open his eyes, not for his own sake, but to see the face of his beloved, devoted daughter just once in this life. Moved by the father's deep sorrow, the monk pointed toward the misty mountains. He spoke of distant Mungunsa Temple and the boundless compassion of the Buddha, who answers the prayers of the sincere believers. He gently shared an ancient truth of the temple. If a believer offered 300 sok of rice to the Buddha with pure devotion, even the blind could receive their sight again by miracle. At those words, a vision of warmth filled Shim Hak-yu's dark world. He imagined the face of his daughter Cheong, shining like a pure lotus flower, bathing his entire mind in a warm light. Overwhelmed by desperate yearning, Shim Hakyu cried out impulsively. He vowed to the heavens that he would deliver those 300 sok of rice to the temple, no matter the cost to himself. The monk looked at him with sudden, deep concern. Knowing the family's extreme poverty, he asked gently if the blind man truly understood the immense, crushing weight of making such a sacred promise. But Shim Hakyu, driven by pure love, did not waver. He solemnly repeated his vow, declaring he would sacrifice anything to gaze upon his daughter's face, cementing the holy promise before the heavens. Seeing his absolute, desperate resolve, the monk bowed and accepted the solemn vow. He gently urged the father to take care of his health first, for a promise requires life to keep it. Just then, Cheong's voice echoed through the diminishing rain. The monk helped Shim Hakyu to a safe, dry rise on the bank, telling him to wait there for his searching, anxious daughter to arrive. Bowing in quiet farewell, the monk departed into the misty night. His lantern flickered softly, growing smaller and smaller against the rain, until it was completely swallowed by the vast, quiet darkness. Left alone, Shim Hakyu felt the cold air clear his mind. He pictured their empty rice jar at home, and the crushing reality of his impossible vow began to settle heavily on his aching heart. As Cheong's calls drew closer, tears of regret and shame streamed down his face. He wept for his foolishness and the terrible, unimaginable burden his impulsive words had placed upon them both so suddenly. Finally, the light of Cheong's lantern caught the familiar, soaked figure on the bank. Recognizing the red ribbon clinging to his wet sleeve, she ran to him, crying out in immense, tearful relief. Kneeling in the wet mud, Cheong threw her arms around her shivering father. She held him tightly, her warm tears mixing with the rain as she comforted his trembling, cold body in the darkness. Shim Hakyu could only whisper apologies through his tears. Cheong gently hushed his regrets, telling him that they must return home to the warmth before the cold damp took his remaining strength and health. As the storm softened to a drizzle, Cheong supported her father, guiding his steps along the muddy path. Together, leaning on each other, they walked slowly back toward their small, quiet, familiar cottage. Back inside their humble cottage, Cheong quickly dried her father and changed him. She warmed a bowl of porridge given by a kind neighbor, offering it to his trembling hands with great love. After a few spoonfuls of warm food, Shim Hakyu broke the quiet. In a trembling, sorrowful voice, he told her of his fall into the creek and the kind monk who saved his life. Then his voice cracked as he confessed the terrible, painful truth. He had promised 300 sok of rice to the temple in exchange for his sight, a debt they could never pay. Cheong reached out and clasped his wrinkled, cold hands in hers. Instead of anger, her heart filled with deep devotion. She promised him they would face this heavy, impossible burden together, always, no matter what. As the first light of dawn crept through the paper window, it illuminated their joined hands and the red ribbon. This impossible promise had now set their destiny on an unalterable, mysterious journey.